Welcome back to the Ivanti Security Insights, where the best practice security meets real-world workplaces and roadblocks. I'm Ashley Stryker, your host, and with us today are Daniel Spicer, Ivanti's very own Chief Security Officer, and Chris Goettl, our VP of Security Product Management. So, Daniel, if you wanted to say a few words and reintroduce yourself to everybody here.
Hey, everyone. It's great to be back. We took a short break, tried to bring in some other experts in the field, but happy to be back on the podcast and looking forward to the discussion.
And I'm Chris Goettl. Again, we are back and ready to start getting into the podcast series again. And with that, we have a new member of the cast. Ashley, I think you need to introduce yourself a little bit here, since it'll be your first episode with Daniel and I.
It is. They already know you guys, but I'm the newbie here. So hi, I'm Ashley. I'm the new Senior Content Marketing Manager here at Ivanti, which means my goal is to make neat and cool things that our customers and other members of the security community would find useful without ever having to buy anything. And to tactically help and support you guys as you maneuver both within the actual technical security aspects of the position, as well as all of those other fluffy human-based obstacles, which I think is going to be a very interesting aspect of our current discussion today. Because Daniel, I hear you were hearing some very interesting rumblings at DevCon and BlackHat a couple of weeks ago, especially around vendor disclosures on vulnerabilities, particularly in the cloud. So if you want to get our discussion today started, I'd love to hear what you heard.
Yeah, absolutely. So there was quite a few cases where Microsoft started having conversations with different parts of the community, and they've been getting a lot of flack recently about some of the changes in how they're, providing disclosures. One of the key things is that they have reduced the amount of detail that they're including in their disclosures. And that they claim they're doing that to help protect their customers as long as possible to make sure they have time to patch. The other interesting item, though, that came out was Microsoft's getting accused of coming in and quote unquote stealth patching certain vulnerabilities in their cloud products, and basically not saying anything about the fact that they had resolved a security issue. And so when we talk about transparency and security, both of these things are really critical. And I think there's a lot of different opinions on both sides of the debate here.
So, Daniel, I do want to stop you right there up front, because I kind of have seen Microsoft as an example of being more forthcoming than most, as far as like, when they release updates, they provide information in there. If there's been a public disclosure, if there's been known exploits for it, there's a lot of other vendors who don't do any of that. So like Apple, for instance, we really never hear anything other than a CVE from Apple unless somebody got it to the press. That's the only time we know anything about something that was actually disclosed or exposed from the Apple side. Adobe, they're probably, okay at telling us when something's actively exploited, but Microsoft is actually, they've gone back and forth on a few things. I do agree they used to provide more messaging around how a vulnerability might be taken advantage of. So that part I have complained about personally, but for the most part, they've been telling people more than most vendors on the market. I mean, Google is probably the only one that I'd put ahead of Microsoft as far as being more broadly open about things. And even they know, so your point about they want to give people more time to patch, Google knows when they release a Chrome update, they've got all the Chromium-based browser variations that also need to update. So they're not going to really talk about things until they've given Edge and Opera and a bunch of the other Chromium-based browsers a chance to update the components in their products as well. But it's interesting that Microsoft is the target of this. Is it is it really they're still the 8,000-pound gorilla, and that's why they're being targeted by this? Or is there something fundamentally flawed in their approach?
Well, and I think I think that's something that's up for debate and discussion, right? I do think a lot of the backlash here comes from a clear change in how they were operating, and that they carry a lot of history with them, right? Microsoft being the largest operating system and one of the just largest software companies, and having vulnerabilities that they've carried for a long time makes them a very important player when you talk about coordinated disclosure. So I think seeing that change is definitely a backlash. And broadly speaking, the people who seem to be complaining the most are actually individuals in the testing and red team communities who really want to be able to go and look at the findings or talk about their own interpretation of the vulnerabilities and dig into what those issues are. Those are the people who I've seen being the loudest about this.
There was that one research team where they couldn't put out the research for something like 6 months because Microsoft hadn't publicly disclosed it, and they didn't want to give, hackers a chance to take advantage of it, like with the Print Nightmare episode, where the researcher had found the vulnerability. That month, Microsoft came out with a different patch for the printers. And so the researcher thought it was the same vulnerability, published it, and immediately everybody was off to the races. So I can understand why. I can see both sides, honestly, because Microsoft doesn't want to give people that lead time, but at the same time, you're hamstringing the rest of the community who rely on the insights from researchers like that and red team findings.
Right. Ashley brings up a good point. Print Nightmare was the example of why you don't want to disclose something before the vendor can put out an update. But once the update is put out, I think so. Let's break the conversation into two parts. Let's cloud aside for a second. Vulnerabilities that we have to take action on, like Print Nightmare. That one, the Microsoft team had actually resolved a different print spooler vulnerability. The researcher didn't realize that and disclosed all of his findings, and it inadvertently triggered a whole mess of activity in the market because it was the mad scramble to go and plug that then before somebody could actively exploit the other variation of vulnerabilities in print spooler that time around. So that's an example of why we need to be responsible about when we disclose. But Daniel, it sounds like you're talking about the next step is now we've got a CVE that's been identified, an update that's now available. There isn't enough information available for teams to go and properly analyze that. And you're speaking from the security perspective, but even from the operations perspective, Microsoft used to do a really good job of let's take a vulnerability that can target an end user. A lot of times you'd see common language like this vulnerability could be used to target a user with a malicious email attachment or through chat, or is the preview pane in Outlook an attack vector? All of those things can tell the IT practitioner what are the ways that this could target my users. It's providing that real world aspect of how could this be exploited? Because at the end of the day, if we don't provide that information, it's not going to give the adversaries that much of a deficit, because once they see the updates coming out from Microsoft, they're going to go and do a differential between the old code and the new code, and they're going to find where all the changes are and reverse engineer it without that knowledge. So all we've done, we in this case, all the vendor has done in this case, whether it's Microsoft or Apple or Google or anybody else, would have been to basically limit the IT professional from being able to understand how this can be used against them in a real world situation, and preventing the security team from having good context to be able to look at this from different angles and make sure they've provided not only the update, but good mitigation around that in other ways that they might want to improve, right?
I think it really comes down to the sophistication of the threat actor, right? Not all threat actors have like strong reverse engineering capabilities, right? It's a lot easier with some of the .NET code, but when you're talking about something that's a native unmanaged code, something in C or C++, right? Reverse engineering that and bringing that into development of a weaponization of that vulnerability takes time, right? On the other hand, I do feel like removing some of that information about how the attack path might be, makes it a question for the threat actors who also in many cases have a set amount of resources should they focus on it, right? So if we see a vulnerability that clearly states like that you can take this vulnerability and target a user and get access to their machine, right? You've made it clear to a certain type of threat actor that this is a vulnerability worth spending their time on. And so I don't know that there's a perfect answer here. To echo some feelings of other researchers that I've talked to, there isn't a perfect answer to how you do this, but I don't actually think that Microsoft's approach here is wrong. Again, their long-term objective here is to slow down weaponization of the vulnerability as much as possible so that the defenders have enough time to patch. And the information they're releasing now still allows you to do this risk-based prioritization that we're all moving to for vulnerability patching. So I actually think they found a fairly reasonable sweet spot. And for the testers who are complaining about the transparency, I don't think that they're complaining for the right reasons. I question their motives a little bit into why they really want that additional detail.
Okay, what do you think some of those motives would be?
Yeah, if you have access to that information, you can use it in a pen test engagement, or you can go write a blog about it and get some additional exposure for your company. Those are the most common ways that we see responsible disclosures and coordinated disclosures used is really to say, we're a good testing company. Look how we found this, right? And obviously, as me as a buyer, I definitely look at those things, but I also look at the timing around those and whether or not I feel that it's responsible. Some of the things for the Exchange vulnerability, for example, that came out, earlier in the year. I looked at the timing of a lot of those testers' blogs and felt very uncomfortable with how much information they made so quickly, because, the attacks were already out there and we were trying to catch up a little bit. At the same time, I think that's another key point that we probably really haven't delved into, right, is how much information should you release based off of whether the exploit is actively being exploited versus something that the company found through a responsible disclosure through their own efforts and haven't had a chance to actually see that in the wild yet. I think that should change the calculus in a very significant way, actually. I would encourage companies to be more aggressive with sharing the knowledge if it's already weaponized and being actively used. So maybe in this case, I'm being a little too hard on the Exchange deal, but that gives the opportunity for companies to create more custom mitigations and gives information out to like IPS and IDS providers.
Well, and that kind of gets into the what's enough information. If it's something that's not disclosed publicly in any way or is not actively being exploited, I can definitely see, less information, better. Is it RCE? Is it PE? What is it a DDoS vulnerability? Things like that give us an understanding of a general sense of where it can be done. And if you look at the CVSS, scoring and look at, if it requires authentication or not, that can also give you a lot of the insights that you may need up front. So not giving as much information in that case like that, I can agree with. If it's been publicly disclosed, then, knowing like, hey, are there already code samples or things available? At this point, the chance of weaponization becomes more and more real. If it's actively being exploited, we do need the information for IT and security professionals to understand how can this be used in a real world attack scenario? And where should I be looking to make sure that I'm already not a victim, right? So I do think there's Daniel's point about changing the calculus behind when and how much gets disclosed is probably something that a lot of vendors need to kind of check with themselves and figure out how they should be going about that.
Well, let's talk about remediation then, because to your point, if it's being actively exploited, right, and they haven't had a chance necessarily to come out with a patch, and some of the bigger vendors want to wait to disclose it until there is an actual patch available, but there are remediation abilities available. Maybe it's air gapping certain things. Maybe it's not, it's upgrading to a different version because the vulnerability only exists on certain versions. Wouldn't that impact the real world ramifications of this kind of, because there's not going to be, everybody's reading every different research vendor blog about the latest stuff. And so that notoriety is great, but for people who are in the weeds executing on different types of vulnerabilities and, on patching and remediations, how can disclosures better help real world application of these sorts of things in actual tactical implementations?
Well, I think a really good example to show how bad it really is, the CISA known exploited vulnerabilities database. If you look at this list, this was a project created late last year, October, November, to try to tell U.S. federal and public sector agencies what they should be doing. The list of vulnerabilities that's tracking now is over 800, all of which are actively being exploited. The majority of vulnerabilities on that list are older than 18 months old, the oldest of which date back to 2006 and 2004. That 2004 vulnerability was for Windows NT4 and Server 2000. There's a bunch of vulnerabilities in there for network hardware, for different middleware platforms that are managing things throughout our environments, aside from just the Microsoft, Adobe, Google, like the major applications that we all see in there. Obviously, not enough real-world ramifications have been provided to people out there to understand you really need to plug this because it's actively being exploited, and here's how it's being used against you. It's a blind spot that, as a global, market perspective goes, the reason why there's this big shift towards a risk-based approach. So we need that risk context to better understand what we should be doing, because the old methods of vulnerability management are flawed.
I was just going to say, I don't think anyone here thinks that responsible disclosure, coordinated disclosure is a bad thing. There needs to be some kind of message that we're giving to end users, to the administrators, that they need to go and take an action to go and resolve a security issue. No, it is in no one's best interest to say nothing. But I think there is a good conversation to have here about what is the right level of information and whether or not the criticism that Microsoft is taking here is for the right reasons. I think that's really, specific to their on-prem products. Is this the right reason? Because for now, they're still providing that information about how severe a potential issue is, and enough information for you to categorize it that way.
So I think this conversation gets exacerbated as we talk about cloud vulnerabilities. So Daniel, I think that's where Microsoft has gotten more of the scrutiny here.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's actually where they got more scrutiny, but it's definitely part of the conversation that's currently happening. Excuse me. So what's essentially happened is several researchers have found out that their vulnerabilities have been patched within the Azure platform or within some of their cloud products. And no communication went out about those vulnerabilities at all. They were completely, as it was said, ninja patched, so that no communication really went out to the end users. There's also some cases where patching had taken a very, very long time in those cases as well, we're talking again, six months or upwards to actually get full resolution of those vulnerabilities. And I think that's a different part of this conversation that's definitely worth taking a deeper dive into.
So researchers found vulnerabilities and were tracking vulnerabilities in the Azure cloud product base for months, and were waiting for Microsoft to disclose their existence so that they could come forward with whatever research they had and all of that. Then they discover, next time they checked 6-7 months later, that Microsoft had just ninja patched the cloud product in Azure and didn't tell anybody. So nobody, hypothetically, nobody knew that there was even a problem or that it was even fixed. And that's a huge problem.
Yeah, and so the depending on who you talk to, the stories differ a little bit. I think there's a bit of game of telephone going on here. Whether or not the researcher was informed about the patching or not patching, I think that's up for debate. But definitely it was up to the researcher to disclose that there was a problem in the first place, because Microsoft was not telling their cloud customers about the fix or the issue.
There are examples of Microsoft releasing a CVE for something that shouldn't have to be, no action should have had to be taken. So Defender is a good example. This is something where they've had multiple CVEs that were resolved. And in the language there, it states very clearly that, hey, this should already be done. It's all good. You don't have to worry about it. It's up to date, right?
That's a should be, right? So, so for a cloud system, right? If you completely own the product and all of the components and there is no action on the customer, there's a good conversation to be had there. But when you talk about Microsoft Defender, which is ultimately an on-prem product where, yeah, it should get patched automatically, but sometimes things happen and you need to go and validate that those patches actually got down to the end system. Maybe it was offline. Maybe there was some other bug in the patch deployments, some kind of corruption when it was getting pulled down from the wire. A CVE is an appropriate way to inform users. And I think that's really important to key off of about what is really the purpose of a CVE. That is a coordinated way so that everyone is talking about the same vulnerability, whether that be your end customers, whether that be trying to uniquely identify the patch from the vendor, or whether that be from security researchers, or even like your vulnerability scanners, right? So that everyone's kind of following that same language. And so I think the question here is, are CVEs appropriate for your cloud products, right? If you truly have no action to take, if a vulnerability scanner is not going to pick it up, right, is a CVE appropriate? And if not, what's the right level of transparency about a cloud vulnerability?
So is there, I guess in the case of a cloud vulnerability, infrastructure was upgraded. Me as the owner of a tenant in that environment, I have nothing to do. I mean, there are some Azure updates where there's a component that runs in your virtual machines that you need to update. And some of those are a little bit painful. Like they're like manually updated and things like that. But those aren't the ones you're talking about here. You're talking about something that's completely owned on the infrastructure side by Microsoft, that even a vendor like Ivanti, where we have our Ivanti Neurons platform is on the Azure stack. They're fixing things that we don't actually take any action on. They're just delivered as a fix into the infrastructure that our product resides in, right? Now, is there any action that we should have to be concerned about there?
I think there is, right? And I have a couple of different hats I'm putting on here, right? On one hand, I am a consumer of Neurons, for example, but I also help with making sure that we do proper announcements and releases for our products on security and talking about responsible disclosure. But for a cloud product, especially as something as critical as IaaS, right, where we're talking about infrastructure and some of those surrounding services, my security team would want to know about that vulnerability so that we can make sure it's not exploited. There is always an assumption being made that your responsible disclosure is a discloser is a good actor. And that's not always the case, right? It is very lucrative to sell these vulnerabilities. You're also making the assumption that it's the only person who found the issue in the first place. And that's a bad assumption. So in order to know that this vulnerability hasn't actually affected you by a more sophisticated threat actor, you need enough detail to go in and investigate yourself, perform a little threat hunt, review some logs. So to be completely silent about it, I don't think that's the right answer.
At what point then, using the example that's been kind of making the rounds, pivoting back a little bit to Microsoft then, just to kind of cap that off here. How, in your opinion, could Microsoft have experimented with better disclosure timelines so that you guys had some sort of notice, even if it was going to be taken care of on their side?
I don't want to get into the timeline specifically for the disclosure. I think a lot of people, like 30 days and 90 days are like common timelines that have been thrown out by security researchers. If you do not patch this by then, I'm going forward anyways. And I think that comes from a place of frustration, right? A lot of these security researchers feel like their issues that they're bringing to light weren't getting fixed, and for a long time from a lot of vendors, and even now still a lot of that's the case. But for vendors who have a responsible disclosure process, who engage with their reporters, that's not really fair. If we're being honest, some of these things take additional time to engineer, and it's not like we have 100 engineers sitting in a corner just waiting for a responsible disclosure to come in and fix. So I don't know that I want to talk about whether or not the timelines are fair, because even as big as Microsoft is, they have legitimate resource constraints. But how to actually get that message out there, I think that the CVE isn't really reasonable in a place where users have no action to take. But you should still put out a security advisory in a way that informs your users that you did have a problem. Here's how it was detected, whether that's internal pen testing or responsible disclosure, and enough details so that they know whether or not, based off of their internal risk, whether or not they need to go and do some research. I think that's appropriate. Ninja patching these issues probably isn't the right answer. I love that we called it ninja patching. This is my favorite thing. But that doesn't feel like the right answer. And that's my opinion coming from both sides of the house.
Do you think that people would have been less frustrated with the timelines if there had been increased and proactive communication with the disclosers of the certain vulnerability, of if there had been proactive, at least back-end channel communication that, yes, we're working on this, this is what we project, and instead of just saying, hey, we got it, and then going crickets for an extended period of time?
Yeah, I think that's very, very possible. Again, we're not privy to all the information of how that went down, and so we would have to look into that communication to really know, and we never will, right? But again, having worked with disclosures in the past, some of them are just burnt so badly in other cases that it doesn't matter how you're trying to act, right? There's an inherent distrust here that is going to be hard to solve. Actually, this is one of the reasons we've spent so much time on this specific topic internally. I think, as we've talked about before, I'm a big fan of game theory. And so we've been playing out some games and scenarios, especially around Prisoner's Dilemma, to try to figure out what the appropriate way to handle a coordinated disclosure is, and try to guess how certain actors will respond based off of their communication and their experience.
Oh, that sounds like a fantastic break point, because I think we've run out of time, unfortunately, for this episode. But put a pin in that, because I am deliriously curious to hear how those tabletop exercises went and to more about that. So thank you both so much for talking about this today. This has been really interesting. Man, I wish I could have been there at the conferences to hear this myself. One day. Thank you both so much for taking the time to chat.
Thanks, Ashley.
Thanks.
And thank you so much for listening and taking some time out of your day. If you want to hear more about the conversations that we're having, particularly when it comes to security and vulnerability disclosure, please feel free to follow us at Ivanti, Ivanti. Please also check the show notes on your podcasting platform of choice. We're going to leave links to the various news stories concerning this bit of a Microsoft vulnerability disclosure brouhaha, as well as some other resources to help you guys figure out how you can mitigate risk and deal with responsibly with certain types of disclosures at your workplace. And if you found today's discussion interesting, we highly encourage you to share it with some teammates, and you guys come up with some great ideas on your own about how you would prefer vendors to see them disclose vulnerabilities without putting all of us at risk of some very creative exploits before a patch is available. And with that, we're going to sign off here. Stay safe, and we'll talk soon.